are. Greetings, everyone. Greetings from Paris, France. My name is KJ, and I am the pastor of Emmanuel International Church at Turn. Since the lockdown began here in France, we've been focusing as a church on what we're calling foundations for life. If we are to be fruitful followers of Jesus, what foundation stones will we need to have in place in our lives? We're continuing to examine that question and answer it together. We've already looked at foundational beliefs like scripture sufficiency and gospel centrality and functional faith and progressive sanctification. Today, we're going to focus on the most controversial foundational truth that we've covered thus far: God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty, the belief that God is ultimately in complete control of what happens in the world. It's more controversial than anything we've covered thus far because it is a more emotional issue than anything we've covered thus far. For some, the idea of God's sovereignty is charged with anger and accusations for them, while for others, it's a belief that brings a deep-rooted emotional peace and is a continual source of comfort. And it's important to recognize that we don't approach this issue morally or emotionally neutral, do we? And even if we come wanting to believe, which most often we don't, even we come wanting to believe, our heart's response may not always be consistent either. Even if you're predisposed to finding peace and comfort in the sovereignty of God, there will be times when you will feel pushed and tested, when your first response may be hurt or bitterness instead of peace and trust. What happens when your belief in God's sovereignty encounters the unexpected death of a beloved pet, like we experienced this week? Or, much greater, the unexpected death of a parent while you're halfway around the world from home, like another member of our congregation experienced this week. Or you have persistent insomnia, like another one of our church members faces every day. Or you're persistently single and you don't want to be. Or all your great plans for this year have just been ruined by a global pandemic. What will be your emotional response to God's sovereignty then? You might respond well today, but what about tomorrow when all those hardships are still there? I want to recognize up front that people's emotional responses are all over the place on the doctrine of God's sovereignty. I want to deal graciously with people, giving them time and space to work through it, because I know I needed time and space to work through it. I also want us to realize that even when God's sovereignty feels like familiar and firm ground for us, that we will all face times of testing. But here's what God calls us to believe. If you have a Bible, open it, take it, and find the book of Romans, Romans chapter 8, and you know what verses. Romans chapter 8, verses 28 through 30. You could turn to any book in the Bible to see God's sovereignty on display, but I want us to focus on the first place it struck me. Romans 8, verses 28 through 30. Let's just look at Romans 8, verse 28 for now. The first time I heard this verse as a teenager, I remember thinking, if this is true, it changes everything. If this one verse is true, it changes everything. Romans 8, 28 says this, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good, to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Just checking to make sure we're still live. Okay. What strikes you as the most crucial word in that sentence? What strikes you as the most crucial word in that sentence? To me, it's got to be the word all. right? All. God causes all things to work together for the good. Paul doesn't say God causes some things to work together for good. He doesn't say God causes most things to work together for good. He literally says God causes all things to work together for the good. The power of that promise rests almost completely on that one word, all. So let's spend time unpacking this one word and thinking through what it means. In order to cause all things to work together for the good, what must God be sovereign over? What things must be under his control? Of course, you say, God must be in control over the good things. And nothing seems clearer than that. James chapter 1 says, every good thing given, every perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. Every good thing in your life is a gift from God. Your family, your possessions, your intellect, your freedom of movement of your limbs, this is all gift to you. Your very next breath are all intentional gifts actively given from a sovereign God. Of course, a good God is in charge of good things, you say. No one gets overly upset about that claim, right? But what about the bad things? Does God's sovereignty extend over evil? Is he control of the bad things that happen too, like global pandemics, viruses, plagues of locusts in East Africa, war, disease, death? There is a view, even among genuine Christians, that says all good things come from God and all bad things come from the devil. Like God and Satan are two equal opposing forces. God is sovereign over all good things, and the devil is sovereign over all bad things. But is that the way God reveals himself to us in the Bible? No, it's not. Not at all. Listen to this, Isaiah 45, verses 6 and 7. God says, I am the Lord, and there is no other, the one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. That's like a spectrum verse on both sides, both ends of the spectrum. I am sovereign. I'm in control. Exodus 4, verse 11, the Lord says to Moses, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not the devil? No, that's not what he says. Is it not I, the Lord, who does those things? Amos 3, verse 6, if a trumpet is blown in the city, will not the people tremble? If a calamity occurs in a city, has not the Lord done it? If a calamity, if an outbreak occurs in the city, isn't God in control? Yes, he is. Hasn't the Lord done it? The Bible doesn't give us a simplistic view where God is in charge of all the good things that happen and someone else, the devil, is in charge of all the bad things. Lamentations 3 says, who is there who speaks and it comes to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both good and ill go forth? God is causing all things to work together for the good, and that means he is in control of the bad things as well. And ask ourselves, would we really want it another way? Would it comfort you if God had no control over the bad things that came into your life? It was all Satan's work and God had no say in it. That's, to me, that's the truly troubling thought. We'll find much more trouble believing that kind of dualism than we will embracing the Bible's more complex view of God, where he rules over both good and evil, but in asymmetric ways. So, if we can accept God's sovereignty over both ends of the spectrum, over good things and over bad things, what about the things in the middle? What about neutral things? What about natural things? What about the things that we attribute to nature, like weather wind, rain, the migration of birds, the pollination of flowers. Job 37 says, from the breath of God, ice is made, and the expanse of the water is frozen. Also, with moisture, he loads the thick clouds. He disperses the clouds of his lightning. It changes direction, turning around by his guidance, that it may do whatever he commands of it on the face of the inhabited earth, whether for correction or for his world or for loving kindness. He causes it to happen. The Bible presents us with a God much bigger and more involved in the world than we can imagine. This God designs every snowflake. He directs every cloud in the sky that we see. He plots the path of every bolt of lightning. Every weather system in all over the world and throughout all of history is obeying his command. And God has multiple purposes at work in all he does. Job said, whether for correction or for the good of his world or for loving kindness, he causes it to happen. That's what it says in the book of Job. And I'll tell you this, if anyone knows something about God's sovereignty over bad things, over natural evil, over weather systems, it's Job, isn't it? Job loses everything in rapid succession, from raiders stealing his cattle, from fire falling from heaven, burning up his flocks, to a strong wind that levels a house and kills all of his children. And in response, Job said, the Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Shall we only accept good from God and not accept adversity? Right now, we know from the first chapter of Job that all this adversity is coming against Job through the adversary, through Satan. But even so, the book of Job says that God is still very much in charge. God says to Satan, you can do this much to Job and no more. You can take his health, but you cannot take his life. God is in complete control while also not being culpable for the evil that is done. And God uses all these bad things to teach Job and us, by extension, far more about himself than we would have known otherwise. We would have known if there had been no suffering. And in the end, Job realizes that the gain of knowing more of God far outweighs all of his losses. So the Bible says God is sovereign over good things, over bad things, over natural things and neutral things. But what about random things? What's the most chance thing you can think of? You ask a board gamer, he can tell you the most chance thing you can think of is the roll of the dice, isn't it? You roll the dice. What does the Bible say about God's control over the random roll of the dice? Do you know? Do you know Proverbs 16:33? The dice are cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord, right? You can't get a more vivid picture of God's sovereignty than that, folks. The roll of the dice is as random as it gets, but even there, God controls the outcome. So, if God is causing all things to work for our good, and that includes good things, bad things, natural things, and random things, what about the choices of free moral agents like us? Don't we have a free will that God has no control over? Aren't we the masters of our own fate and the captains of our own soul? Now, as beings made in the image of God, we do possess a certain kind of freedom. We do possess a type of free will, but it isn't a freedom from God. That's not the kind of freedom we have. That's not the sense in which we are free. We make choices, but God freely reigns over the choices we make. Proverbs 16, verse 6, you know this? The mind of the man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Yes, make your plans, But what actually happens will be God's plan. Remember, Book of James, you say, I'm going to go to this city and we'll live there, we'll engage in business, we'll make a profit. And James says, what? He says, rather, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will go there and do this or that. It's ultimately God's plan, not yours, what actually happens in history. King David knew this. Psalm 139, he says, oh Lord, you know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thoughts from afar. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, you know it all. And he goes on to say, verse 16, in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. Not just our days were numbered, but our days' events were all written in the book of God's decrees, long before we ever lived out a single one of them. Perhaps that truth and what David said there, perhaps that feels confining to you. Like God has already planned all the good I'll ever do, as well as all the bad that I'll ever encounter. Perhaps that feels very confining to you. But to Christians throughout history, it has felt supremely comforting. For them, God's sovereignty wasn't a wall to hit their head against, but a pillow to lay their head upon at night. And God's sovereignty can be that way for you too. Many Christians, including myself, have found God's sovereignty to be such a comforting thing, especially in the face of evil and suffering. You know who John Bunyan is? He was the great Baptist preacher who was held in prison for years and years because he was preaching the gospel. He could have left at any time if he had sworn that he would no longer preach. He said this, John Bunyan said, we should not be afraid of men, as if they were let loose to do to us and with us what they will. God's bridle is upon them. God's hook is in their nose. God has determined their bounds, the bounds of their rage. And if he lets them drive his church into the sea of troubles, it shall be up to the neck, and so far it may go and not be drowned. I say the Lord has hold of them and orders them, nor do they at any time come against his people, but by his license and commission. How far to go and where to stop. That's what the Lord decides. Now, you may not be facing people oppressing you to the level that John Bunyan did, but you may have a bad boss that you have to deal with, or a difficult government agent handling your case at the prefecture when you arrive. Or you may feel like certain officials who have power over you are misusing their power, especially in this time of crisis. But guess what? God's hook is in their nose. Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. If that's true for kings, it's true for presidents and prime ministers and dictators. God is in control. What many a time I've thought about that verse, God turns their hearts wherever he wishes, as I was going into a meeting where it seemed like someone else had power over me, as though their word could direct the course of my life in one direction or another. It looked like they had power to make my life a lot harder or a lot easier. But ultimately, God governs those who govern us. And he can work his will even in the midst of overwhelmingly negative situations, including pandemics and plague and wrongful imprisonment. Just ask Joseph about that one. He tells his brothers, what you meant for evil, selling me into slavery, me going to prison. What you meant for evil, it was evil, but God meant it for good. By the way, I really gutted this sermon of a lot of great examples that I originally had in here just for time's sake. I've talked about Job already, but I also wanted to talk a lot about Joseph and about Jonah and about Jacob. I mean, basically, if your name started with a J in the Bible, I had great examples of God's sovereignty working in your life. But there's one J name that I couldn't cut away, and you know what it is, Jesus. The prime example, always, isn't it, is Jesus. Remember Acts chapter 4, verse 27, 28? It says, "For truly in this city, in Jerusalem, there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur." Those are pretty strong words, aren't they? Do you understand what the Bible's saying? All the forces in Jerusalem, the rulers, the Romans, the Pharisees, all these were aligned against Jesus, intent to kill him. But what were they really doing? Acts chapter 4 says they were doing whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. Yeah, make no mistake, all these people involved were free agents, and they were doing the evil that was in their hearts. They're responsible for it because they did whatever was in their hearts. But instead of it working against God's plan, it was actually all part of God's plan. And God worked out their evil intentions for our eternal good. Again, Romans 8:28, God works all things, even the evil schemes of the Pharisees and the rulers. God worked all things together for good, including the greatest evil ever done. God taking on flesh, walking our streets, and we killed him. If God can work that for good, he can work anything for good. So we see that God's sovereignty over all things rightly includes good things, bad things, natural things, random things, and even free human choices. You can believe all that is true, but still exclude one thing from God's control in your heart. We can accept God's sovereignty over every area of the universe except for this one. Do you know what it is? You know what I'm going to say? We can accept God's sovereignty over every area except this one: salvation. Salvation. God's sovereignty in salvation is a divisive thing in our day. And it was in Paul's day as well. Paul had these conversations so often that he knows how people are going to respond. He knows our objections. He knows we're going to say what we're going to say to him. So he asked our questions for us. If you were to flip over one chapter to Romans chapter 9, you can do flip over there if you want to. Paul talks about God's sovereignty in salvation, and he begins with an example. God chose Jacob and not Esau. Paul says God made his choice long before the twins were born, long before they had done anything good or bad. Paul anticipates your questions and objections in verse 14. And he knows you're going to say to him, that doesn't seem fair. Is there injustice in God? It seems unjust to choose one twin over the other before they were ever born. If you've never asked questions like that before, it's probably because you've never seriously wrestled with the Bible's teaching on God's sovereignty in salvation. Paul says it's okay to ask those questions because Paul's actually asking those questions for us in advance, so we don't have to ask them. It's okay to ask those questions as long as you're ready to hear the Bible's answer. Paul answers your claim of God's injustice with God's claim of freedom. Is there injustice with God then? What does Paul say? Romans 9. By no means is God unjust. Verse 15, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Paul says God is free. God is free to show mercy to whom he wants. And if that's true, Paul says, then this is also true. Verse 16, so then salvation, does not depend upon the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. According to Paul, the ultimate determiner in our salvation isn't our will, it's not our effort, but it is God who has mercy. In verse 17, Paul then describes another example, Pharaoh. He brings up Pharaoh, and he anticipates the question you're going to be asking next. You will say to me then, why does God still find fault? For who can resist his will? God hardened Pharaoh's heart. You're going to respond by asking the question, why does God still find fault then? Who could resist God's will? If you're struggling with God's sovereignty and salvation, this is probably the kind of question you've been wrestling with. And Paul isn't surprised by that. He has probably had this same conversation hundreds of times with hundreds of people just like you. He knows what your questions are going to be, but do you know what his answer is? It's probably the more important question for us. He knows your question. Do you know his answer? Verse 20, he answers your question. On the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? Who are you to ask such a question of your maker? Will the thing molded, will it not say to the molder, why did you make me like this? Will it? Yeah. Paul's answer there may not feel like the most satisfying answer you've ever heard. God is God and you are not. He's the potter, you are the clay. That may not feel like the most satisfying answer, but it is the answer we're given. And it is an answer that leaves room for trust. God, I trust you're sovereign over this, even when I don't understand it. Paul has more to say in Romans 9, but that's for another day. For now, look back over to Romans 8 for just a minute, because God's sovereignty and salvation is also what's at stake in verses 29 and 30. Look with me there. Again, let's start in verse 28. It says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for the good, to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. We'll unpack what this means as we meet together this week. It's a bit of an incentive. If you haven't jumped into some of our home groups or small groups, you need to do that. We'll unpack that more. But for now, I think it's enough to see that God is in control through the whole process of saving us. He is always the party doing the action. He foreknew, he predestined, he called, he justified, he glorified. God is always the actor. We are always the ones being acted upon in that chain of salvation. And that's good news. Things would really be messed up otherwise. Don't we know that? It's good that God is the actor in all this. Let me close. Let me try to bring things to a close here by asking ourselves two application questions. What does it look like when our hearts live in functional unbelief of God's sovereignty? And what kind of world opens up to us when our hearts really do believe, Romans 8:28, really do believe that God is in control of all things and working them all for the good? Essentially, let's look at the side. Let's look at this issue from both sides, from the side of believing it and the side of unbelieving it. What does that look like in our lives? So first, what does it look like when our hearts live in functional unbelief? What are the symptoms of unbelief in God's sovereignty? I think the most obvious one is worry, isn't it? Without a functional faith in God's sovereignty, we live in a world of worry. Whenever our hearts are full of anxiety and worry, we are acting like God isn't in control. God doesn't have this. We worry like God isn't wise enough or powerful enough to work things out for good. We're like the children always anxious about dinner. My child, don't you trust us as parents that will feed you, that will give you what's best? There's been some times in our household where Lynn has gone away for some time, for a week. And initially the kids are like, what are we going to do? How are we going to live? What are we going to eat? When children act this way, like they'll go hungry, it shows they don't trust in their father's ability to provide. They don't trust in his ability or in his character. Just like mistrusting children, our hearts fail to understand and trust in God's sovereignty when we are full of worry. A world of unbelief in God's sovereignty is a world of worry. And it's a world of burdens, a world of burdens. If God's not in control, then things in my life are all on me. I've got to keep all the plates spinning. I've got to keep working and doing because it all depends on me. On top of this, when our hearts don't believe God's sovereignty in salvation, then the eternal fate of others is also a burden we bear entirely on our own shoulders. My heart will not allow me any rest or peace because the souls of everyone around me hangs in the balance, and their salvation is all on me. It's all on my persuasiveness, all in the strength of my witness for Christ. And this becomes a crushing burden. Crushing burdens are a sure sign that our hearts are not resting in God's sovereignty. One last symptom that our hearts are not functionally believing in God's sovereignty is that we will live in a world of frustrations. Now, that can hit really close to home for immigrants and expats, like pretty much everyone in our church. People living outside your home country and culture, because many things don't work like we expect them to. And there's so many opportunities for frustration in daily life. Buses run late or they don't run at all. Train lines are closed and there's no obvious reason. Things break and you don't know how to fix them. You don't know where to fix them. But God was ultimately in charge of all these things back in our home country, wasn't he? Isn't he also in charge of them here as well? I'm showing I don't really believe God is working all things together for my good when I can't stop being frustrated and bitter about transportation strikes and social distancing rules. How many times has God saved us from accident, injury, or even death by throwing off our plans? We'll never know. You have no idea how many times God has saved your life. And to you, it was just a frustrating delay in your commute home. We may say that we believe in God's control, but this is what our lives will look like when we live in functional God's sovereignty. We will live in a world of worries and burdens and frustrations. So, what happens in our hearts when we do functionally believe in God's sovereignty? What new worlds open up to us when we believe that God is in control of all things? First, I believe it is a world of wonder that opens up before us. God's hand is on display in literally everything around us. The bird singing in the tree that only you notice, guess what? It is singing for you. God appointed it to be there for you to smile as you listen to it, and he made that appointment before the foundation of the world. That seashell that you pick up on the beach, guess what? God guided it there for you. He brought all those different bits together, however seashells are made, I don't know. God brought all those things together. God knew and planned from eternity that it would be you one day picking up that shell, and you would set it upon your shelf. And God planned and knew all the special memories of a day at the seaside that you would have connected to it. And that's a thing of wonder, isn't it? We enter into a world of wonder when our hearts embrace God's sovereignty over all things. Your life is now full of divine appointments. If God is sovereign, there's no such thing as chance meeting or phone calls. God intended you to bump into that person. God intended for your car to be there when your neighbor backed into it. That's how I met one of my closest friends now, a guy I discipled. That's your story, Matt, if you're watching. When you believe in God's sovereignty, you live in a world of wonder, full of divine appointments. You also live in a world of hope. God's sovereignty isn't meant to be a stone wall that we knock our heads against, but a soft feather mattress that we fall into. The Bible doesn't present God's sovereignty to us as some big philosophical problem that we need to solve. The Bible presents a God who's in control of all things for our comfort and our hope. Not a problem to solve, but a pillow to lay our heads down on at night. We need to live in hope that God is working out the details of our day and for our ultimate good and for his glory. Here is a personal example of when this really clicked for me. My first trip to England was in 2000 with my church. We were on a choir tour there. We were on our way in a bus to sing at First Baptist Oxford. We were all looking forward to it. To this day, I don't know what First Baptist Oxford looks like because we never made it there. The bus broke down on the way. But the amazing thing was that we were all on this bus, and the dominant feeling was God is in control. God's in charge of buses breaking down. I wonder what he has for us. Our choir leader got off the bus, and just the neighborhood where we broke down was walking around, and he found a church that was meeting in someone's home. All came back to the bus, took us all off. We all went in this home, and we sang. We ministered to them. They ministered to us. And on that trip to a person, everyone said that was the most meaningful thing we did that time. That is why God had us there. God is in control of all things. And when we look at even the inconveniences in our life that way, who knows what God might do? Maybe the most meaningful thing you've done that day is that big inconvenience. When we believe the promise of Romans 8:28, God's sovereignty becomes the most hopeful thing imaginable. You can rest now. You can really rest. Like the hardworking farmer in Jesus' story, you can do your work as unto the Lord and then go home and go to bed, knowing God causes the seed to grow in the night. Believing in God's sovereignty opens up a world of hope for us. It also brings us into a world of trust, because many things that happen will not be good. Many will be hard. Many will be horrible. Global pandemics will come. You will be hit by personal tragedy. And it will be hard to see how God could possibly bring anything good out of such bad things. But this is a call to trust. This is a call to trust your Father. Trust that he is wise enough to bring good out of this terrible evil. Trust that he is powerful enough to do it. Trust his character is good enough to redeem our suffering. And to go on trusting even if we can't see how he is doing it. I think one day we will see how he's worked all things together for good. But today, we're called to trust. We're called to trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. If you're like me, it's easier to trust God with the big things than in the small, everyday things. A global pandemic is easy because it's really big. It's an obvious place to trust God, but losing my keys is hard. That's the hard thing. The small things are where I struggle to trust, where I'm most likely to be frustrated. The small everyday annoyances is where I have to learn to trust in God's sovereignty. In the unexpected argument with a spouse, in the kids asking for something when I've just sat down, in being interrupted while doing deep work. John Newton once said this, and I love it so much because it shows a functional faith in God's sovereignty. This is what I want to be like. John Newton said, "When I hear a knock at my study door, I hear a message from God. It may be a lesson of instruction, perhaps a lesson of patience, but since it is his message, it must be interesting." God is in control of the small interruptions in your day. Perhaps you're working from home and you really needed to hear that. God is in control of the small interruptions in your day, as well as the pandemic level interruptions in your life. You'd be much happier if you acted like you believed it. God is in control. You'd be much happier if you acted like you believed that was true. Let's embrace such a strong belief in God's sovereignty that the frustration of interruptions lose their hold over our hearts, that the worries of work can't get their claws into us, that the crushing burdens of everything being on our shoulders simply fall off, roll off our backs. Let's see the foundation stone of God's sovereignty grow larger and larger in our lives. To the extent we grow in this area, to that extent we'll find ourselves leaving the old world of worries and burdens and frustrations and moving into a new world of wonder, hope, and a joyful trust in our Father. Let's pray together. Father, I ask that you would give us a functional faith that you are on your throne and your sovereignty rules over all. Lord, may we look to you as a good Father through whose hands all things come to us. May we trust your wisdom in it. May we trust your goodness. May we trust when we can't see how this could possibly turn out for our good, we can't see what you're doing. May we trust in your heart and in your character that you are good and you will work all things for the good. And ultimately, one day we will see it and rejoice. But Lord, may we trust you now when it's hard to see. I ask this in Jesus' name for his glory. Amen.